Chapter 10. The observer was Martin Ricardo. To him, life was not a matter of passive renunciation, but of a particularly active warfare. He was not mistrustful of it. He was not disgusted with it. Still less was he inclined to be suspicious of its disenchantments. But he was vividly aware that it held many possibilities of failure. Though very far from being a pessimist, he was not a man of foolish illusions. He did not like failure, not only because of its unpleasant and dangerous consequences, but also because of its damaging effect upon his own appreciation of Martin Ricardo. And this was a special job, of his own contriving, and of considerable novelty. It was not, so to speak, in his usual line of business, except perhaps from a moral standpoint, about which he was not likely to trouble his head. For these reasons, Martin Ricardo was unable to sleep. Mr. Jones, after repeated shivering fits, and after drinking much hot tea, had apparently fallen into deep slumber. He had very peremptorily discouraged attempts at conversation on the part of his faithful follower. Ricardo listened to his regular breathing. It was all very well for the governor. He looked upon it as a sort of sport. A gentleman naturally would. But this ticklish and important job had to be pulled off at all costs, both for honour and for safety. Ricardo rose quietly and made his way on the veranda. He could not lie still. He wanted to go out for air, and he had a feeling that by the force of his eagerness even the darkness and the silence could be made to yield something to his eyes and ears. He noted the stars and stepped back again into the dense darkness. He resisted the growing impulse to go out and steal towards the other bungalow. It would have been madness to start prowling in the dark on unknown ground. And for what end? Unless to relieve the oppression. Immobility lay on his limbs like a leaden garment. And yet he was unwilling to give up. He persisted in his objectless vigil. The man of the island was keeping quiet. It was at that moment that Ricardo's eyes caught the vanishing red trail of light made by the cigar, a startling revelation of the man's wakefulness. He could not suppress a low "Hello?" and began to sidle along towards the door, with his shoulders rubbing the wall. For all he knew, the man might have been out in front by this time, observing the veranda. As a matter of fact, after flinging away the cheroot, Haste had gone indoors with the feeling of a man who gives up an unprofitable occupation. But Ricardo fancied he could hear faint footfalls on the open ground, and dodged quickly into the room. There he drew breath and meditated for a while. His next step was to feel for the matches on the tall desk and to light the candle. He had to communicate to his governor views and reflections of such importance that it was absolutely necessary for him to watch their effect on the very countenance of the hearer. At first he thought that these matters could have waited till daylight, but Haste's wakefulness, disclosed in that startling way, made him feel suddenly certain that there could be no sleep for him that night. He said as much to his governor. When the little dagger-like flame had done its best to dispel the darkness, Mr. Jones was to be seen reposing on a camp bedstead in a distant part of the room. A railway rug concealed his spare form up to his very head, which rested on the other railway rug rolled up for a pillow. Ricardo plumped himself down cross-legged on the floor, very close to the low bedstead, so that Mr. Jones, who perhaps had not been so very profoundly asleep, on opening his eyes found them conveniently levelled at the face of his secretary. "Eh? What is it you say? No sleep for you tonight? But why can't you let me sleep? Confound your fussiness." "Because that there fellow can't sleep, that's why. Dash me if he hasn't been doing a think just now. What business had he to think in the middle of the night?" "How do you know?" "He was out, sir, up in the middle of the night. My own eyes saw it." "But how do you know that he was up to think?" inquired Mr. Jones. "It might have been anything. Toothache, for instance. And you might have dreamed it for all I know. Didn't you try to sleep?" "No, sir. I didn't even try to go to sleep." Ricardo informed his patron of his vigil on the veranda, and of the revelation which put an end to it. He concluded that a man up with a cigar in the middle of the night must be doing a think. Mr. Jones raised himself on his elbow. This sign of interest comforted his faithful henchman. "Seems to me it's time we did a little think ourselves," added Ricardo with more assurance. Long as they had been together, the moods of his governor were still a source of anxiety to his simple soul. "You're always making a fuss," remarked Mr. Jones in a tolerant tone. "Aye, but not for nothing, am I? You can't say that, sir. Mine may not be a gentleman's way of looking round a thing, but it isn't a fool's way either. You've admitted that much yourself at odd times." Ricardo was growing warmly argumentative. Mr. Jones interrupted him without heat. "You haven't roused me to talk about yourself, I presume?" "No, sir." Ricardo remained silent for a minute, with the tip of his tongue caught between his teeth. "I don't think I could tell you anything about myself that you don't know," he continued. There was a sort of amused satisfaction in his tone, which changed completely as he went on. "It's that man over there that's got to be talked over. I don't like him." He failed to observe the flicker of a ghastly smile on his governor's lips. "Don't you?" murmured Mr. Jones, whose face, as he reclined on his elbow, was on a level with the top of his follower's head. "No, sir," said Ricardo emphatically. The candle from the other side of the room threw his monstrous black shadow on the wall. I don't know how to say it. He isn't arty-like." Mr. Jones agreed languidly in his own manner. "He seems to be a very self-possessed man." "Aye, that's it, Ricardo choked with indignation. "I would soon let out some of his self-possession through a hole between his ribs, if this weren't a special job." Mr. Jones had been making his own reflections, for he asked, "Do you think he's suspicious?" "I don't see very well what he can be suspicious of," pondered Ricardo. "Yet there he was doing a think. And what could be the object of it? What made him get out of bed in the middle of the night? Take fleas, surely." "Bad conscience, perhaps," suggested Mr. Jones jocularly. His faithful secretary suffered from irritation and did not see the joke. In a fretful tone he declared that there was no such thing as conscience. There was such a thing as funk, but there was nothing to make that fellow funky in any special way. He admitted, however, that the man might have been uneasy at the arrival of strangers, because of all that plunder of his put away somewhere. Ricardo glanced here and there, as if he were afraid of being overheard by the heavy shadows cast by the dim light all over the room. His patron, very quiet, spoke in a calm whisper. "And perhaps that hotel-keeper has been lying to you about him. He may be a very poor devil indeed." Ricardo shook his head slightly. The Schomburgian theory of haste had become in him a profound conviction, which he had absorbed as naturally as a sponge takes up water. His patron's doubts were a wanton denying of what was self-evident, but Ricardo's voice remained as before, a soft purring with a snarling undertone. "I'm surprised at you, sir. It's the very way them tame ones, the common hypocrites of the world, get on. When it comes to plunder drifting under one's very nose, there's not one of them that would keep his hands off. I don't blame them. It's the way they do it that sets my back up. Just look at the story of how he got rid of that pal of his. Sent a man home to croak of a cold on the chest. That's one of your tame tricks. And do you mean to say, sir, that a man that's up to it wouldn't bag whatever he could lay his hands on in his hypocritical way? What was all that coal business? Tame citizen dodge. Hypocrisy, nothing else. No, sir. The thing is to extract it from him as neatly as possible. That's the job. And it isn't so simple as it looks. I reckon you've looked it all round, sir, before you took up the notion of this trip." No. Mr. Jones was hardly audible, staring far away from his couch. "I didn't think about it much. I was bored." "Aye, that you were. Bad. I was feeling pretty desperate that afternoon when that bearded softy of a landlord got talking to me about this fellow here. Quite accidentally it was. Well, sir, here we are after a mighty narrow squeak. I feel all limp yet, but never mind. His swag'll pay for the lot." "He's all alone here," remarked Mr. Jones in a hollow murmur. "Yes, in a way. Yes, alone enough. Yes, you may say he is." "There's that Chinaman, though." "Aye, there's the Chink. assented Ricardo, rather absent-mindedly. He was debating in his mind the advisability of making a clean breast of his knowledge of the girl's existence. Finally, he concluded he wouldn't. The enterprise was difficult enough, without complicating it with an upset to the sensibilities of the gentleman with whom he had the honour of being associated. Let the discovery come of itself, he thought, and then he could swear that he had known nothing of that offensive presence. He did not need to lie. He had only to hold his tongue. "Yes," he muttered reflectively, "there's that chink, certainly." At bottom, he felt a certain ambiguous respect for his governor's exaggerated dislike of women, as if that horror of feminine presence were a sort of depraved morality, but still morality, since he counted it as an advantage. It prevented many undesirable complications. He did not pretend to understand it. He did not even try to investigate this idiosyncrasy of his chief. All he knew was that he himself was differently inclined, and that it did not make him any happier or safer. He did not know how he would have acted if he had been knocking about the world on his own. Luckily, he was a subordinate, not a wage slave, but a follower, which was a restraint. Yes, the other sort of disposition simplified matters in general. It wasn't to be gainsaid. But it was clear that it could also complicate them, as in this most important, and in Ricardo's view already sufficiently delicate case. And the worst of it was that no one could tell exactly in what precise manner it would act. It was unnatural, he thought, somewhat peevishly. How was one to reckon up the unnatural? There were no rules for that. The faithful henchman of plain Mr. Jones, foreseeing many difficulties of a material order, decided to keep the girl out of the governor's knowledge, out of his sight too, for as long a time as it could be managed. That, alas, seemed to be at most a matter of a few hours, whereas Ricardo feared that to get the affair properly going would take some days. Once well started, he was not afraid of his gentleman failing him. As is often the case with lawless natures, Ricardo's faith in any given individual was of a simple, unquestioning character. For man must have some support in life. Cross-legged, his head drooping a little and perfectly still, he might have been meditating in a bonze-like attitude upon the sacred syllable Om. It was a striking illustration of the untruth of appearances, for his contempt for the world was of a severely practical kind. There was nothing oriental about Ricardo, but the amazing quietness of his pose. Mr. Jones was also very quiet. He had let his head sink on the rolled-up rug, and lay stretched out on his side with his back to the light. In that position, the shadows gathered in the cavities of his eyes made them look perfectly empty. When he spoke, his ghostly voice had only to travel a few inches straight into Ricardo's left ear. "Why don't you say something now that you've got me awake?" "I wonder if you were sleeping as sound as you were trying to make out, sir," said the unmoved Ricardo. "I wonder," repeated Mr. Jones. "At any rate, I was resting quietly." "Come, sir," Ricardo's whisper was alarmed. "You don't mean to say that you're going to be bored?" "No." "Quite right." The secretary was very much relieved. "There's no occasion to be, I can tell you, sir," he whispered earnestly. "Anything but that. If I didn't say anything for a bit, it ain't because there isn't plenty to talk about. Aye, more than enough." "What's the matter with you?" breathed out his patron. "Are you going to turn pessimist?" "Me turn? No, sir. I ain't one of those that turn. You may call me hard names if you like, but you know very well that I ain't a croaker." Ricardo changed his tone. "If I said nothing for a while, it was because I was meditating over the chink, sir." "You were? Waste of time, my Martin. A Chinaman is unfathomable." Ricardo admitted that this might be so. Anyhow, a chink was neither here nor there, as a general thing, unfathomable as he might be. But the Swedish baron wasn't, couldn't be. The woods were full of such barons. "I don't know that he is so tame," was Mr. Jones's remark, in a sepulchral undertone. "How do you mean, sir? He ain't a rabbit, of course. You couldn't hypnotise him, as I saw you do to more than one dago and other kinds of tame citizens, when it came to the point of holding them down to a game." "Don't you reckon on that?" murmured plain Mr. Jones seriously. "No, sir, I don't. Though you have a wonderful power of the eye, it's a fact." "I have a wonderful patience," remarked Mr. Jones dryly. A dim smile flitted over the lips of the faithful Ricardo, who never raised his head. I don't want to try you too much, sir, but this is like no other job we ever turned our minds to. Perhaps not. At any rate, let us think so. A weariness with the monotony of life was reflected in the tone of this qualified assent. It jarred on the nerves of the sanguine Ricardo. Let us think of the way to go to work, he retorted a little impatiently. He's a deep one. Just look at the way he treated that chum of his. Do you ever hear of anything so low? And the artfulness of the beast. The dirty, tame artfulness. Don't you start moralising, Martin, said Mr. Jones, warningly. As far as I can make out the story that German hotel keeper told you, it seems to show a certain amount of character and independence from common feelings, which is not usual. It's very remarkable, if true. Aye, very remarkable. It's mighty low down, all the same, muttered Ricardo obstinately. I must say I'm glad to think he'll be paid off for it in a way that'll surprise him. The tip of his tongue appeared lively for an instant, as if trying for the taste of that ferocious retribution on his compressed lips. For Ricardo was sincere in his indignation before the elementary principle of loyalty to a chum, violated in cold blood, slowly, in a patient duplicity of years. There are standards in villainy as in virtue, and the act as he pictured it to himself acquired an additional horror from the slow pace of that treachery, so atrocious and so tame. But he understood, too, the educated judgment of his governor, a gentleman looking on all this with the privileged detachment of a cultivated mind, of an elevated personality. Aye, he's deep, he's artful, he mumbled between his sharp teeth. Confound you! Mr. Jones's calm whisper crept into his ear. Come to the point. Obedient, the secretary shook off his thoughtfulness. There was a similarity of mind between these two, one the outcast of his vices, the other inspired by a spirit of scornful defiance, the aggressiveness of a beast of prey looking upon all the tame creatures of the earth as its natural victim. Both were astute enough, however, and both were aware that they had plunged into this adventure without a sufficient scrutiny of detail. The figure of a lonely man, far from all assistance, had loomed up largely, fascinating and defenceless in the middle of the sea, filling the whole field of their vision. There had not seemed to be any need for thinking. As Schomberg had been saying, 3-1. But it did not look so simple now in the face of that solitude, which was like an armour for this man. The feeling voiced by the henchman in his own way, we don't seem much forwarder now we are here, was acknowledged by the silence of the patron. It was easy enough to rip a fellow up or drill a hole in him, whether he was alone or not. Ricardo reflected in low, confidential tones, but he isn't alone, Mr. Jones said faintly, in his attitude of a man composed for sleep. Don't forget that Chinaman. Ricardo started slightly. Oh, aye, the chink. Ricardo had been on the point of confessing about the girl, but no, he wanted his governor to be unperturbed and steady. Vague thoughts, which he hardly dared to look in the face, were stirring his brain in connection with that girl. She couldn't be much account, he thought. She could be frightened. And there were also other possibilities. The chink, however, could be considered openly. What I was thinking about it, sir, he went on earnestly, is this. Here we've got a man. He's nothing. If he won't be good, he can be made quiet. That's easy. But then there's his plunder. He doesn't carry it in his pocket. I hope not, breathed Mr. Jones. Same here. It's too big, we know. But if he were alone, he would not feel worried about it overmuch. I mean the safety of the pieces. He would just put the lot into a box or drawer that was handy. Would he? Yes, sir. He would keep it under his eye, as it were. Why not? It's natural. A fellow doesn't put his swag underground, unless there's a very good reason for it. Very good reason, eh? Yes, sir. What do you think a fellow is? A mole? From his experience, Ricardo declared that the man was not a burrowing beast. Even the misers very seldom buried their hoard, unless for exceptional reasons. In the given situation of a man alone on an island, the company of a chink was a very good reason. Drawers would not be safe, nor boxes either, from a prying, slant-eyed chink. No, sir, unless a safe, a proper office safe. But the safe was there in the room. "Is there a safe in this room? I didn't notice it," whispered Mr. Jones. That was because the thing was painted white, like the walls of the room, and besides it was tucked away in the shadows of a corner. Mr. Jones had been too tired to observe anything on his first coming ashore, but Ricardo had very soon spotted the characteristic form. He only wished he could believe that the plunder of treachery, duplicity, and all the moral abominations of haste had been there. But no, the blamed thing was open. "It might have been there at one time or another," he commented gloomily, "but it isn't there now." "The man did not elect to live in this house," remarked Mr. Jones. And by the by, what could he have meant by speaking of circumstances which prevented him lodging in the other bungalow? "You remember what he said, Martin?" Sounded cryptic. Martin, who remembered and understood the phrase as directly motivated by the existence of the girl, waited a little before saying, "Some of his artfulness, sir. Not the worst of it either. That manner of his to us, this asking no questions, is some more of his artfulness. A man's bound to be curious, and he is. Yet he goes on as if he didn't care. He does care. Or else what was the doing up with a cigar in the middle of the night, doing a think? I don't like it." "He may be outside, observing the light here, and saying the very same thing to himself of our own wakefulness," gravely suggested Ricardo's governor. "He may be, sir, but this is too important to be talked over in the dark. And the light is all right. It can be accounted for. There's a light in this bungalow in the middle of the night because, why, you're not well. Not well, sir. That's what's the matter. And you will have to act up to it." The consideration had suddenly occurred to the faithful henchman in the light of a felicitous expedient to keep his governor and the girl apart as long as possible. Mr. Jones received the suggestion without the slightest stir, even in the deep sockets of his eyes, where a steady, faint gleam was the only thing telling of life and attention in his attenuated body. But Ricardo, as soon as he had enunciated his happy thought, perceived in it other possibilities more to the point and of greater practical advantage. "With your looks, sir, it will be easy enough," he went on evenly, as if no silence had intervened, always respectful, but frank with perfect simplicity of purpose. "All you've got to do is just lie down quietly. I noticed him sort of surprised at you on the wharf, sir." At these words, a naive tribute to the aspect of his physique, even more suggestive of the grave than of the sick-bed, a fold appeared on that side of the governor's face which was exposed to the dim light, a deep, shadowy, semicircular fold from the side of his nose to the bottom of his chin, a silent smile. By a side glance, Ricardo had noticed this play of features. He smiled too, appreciative, encouraged. "And you as hard as nails all the time," he went on. "Hang me if anybody would believe you aren't sick, if I were to swear myself black in the face. Give us a day or two to look into matters and size up that hypocrite." Ricardo's eyes remained fixed on his crossed chins. The chief, in his lifeless accents, approved. "Perhaps it would be a good idea." "The chink, he's nothing. He can be made quiet any time." One of Ricardo's hands, reposing palm upwards on his folded legs, made a swift thrusting gesture, repeated by the enormous darting shadow of an arm very low on the wall. It broke the spell of perfect stillness in the room. The secretary eyed moodily the wall from which the shadow had gone. Anybody could be made quiet, he pointed out. It was not anything that the chink could do. No, it was the effect that his company must have produced on the conduct of the doomed man. A man? What was a man? A Swedish baron could be ripped up or else holed by a shot as easily as any other creature. But that was exactly what was to be avoided, till one knew where he had hidden his plunder. "I shouldn't think it would be some sort of hole in his bungalow," argued Ricardo with real anxiety. "No, a house can be burnt, set on fire accidentally, or on purpose, while the man's asleep. Under the house, or in some crack, cranny or crevice." Something told him it wasn't that. The anguish of mental effort contracted Ricardo's brow. The skin of his head seemed to move in this travail of vain and tormenting suppositions. "What do you think a fellow is, sir? Baby?" he said, in answer to Mr. Jones's objections. "I'm trying to find out what I would do myself. He wouldn't be likely to be cleverer than I am." "And what do you know about yourself?" Mr. Jones seemed to watch his follower's perplexities with an amusement concealed in a death-like composure. Ricardo disregarded the question. The material vision of the spoil absorbed all his faculties. A great vision. He seemed to see it. A few small canvas bags tied up with thin cord, their distended rotundity showing the inside pressure of the disc-like forms of coins. Gold, solid, heavy, eminently portable. Perhaps steel cash boxes with a chased design on the covers, or perhaps a blackened brass box with a handle on the top and full of goodness knows what. Banknotes? Well, why not? The fellow had been going home, so it was surely something worth going home with. And he might have put it anywhere outside. Anywhere, cried Ricardo in a deadened voice. In the forest. That was it. A temporary darkness replaced the dim light of the room. The darkness of the forest at night, and in it the gleam of a lantern, by which a figure is digging at the foot of a tree trunk. As likely as not, another figure holding that lantern. Ha! Feminine! The girl! The prudent Ricardo stifled a picturesque and profane exclamation, partly joy, partly dismay. Had the girl been trusted or mistrusted by that man? Whatever it was bound to be holy. With women there could be no half measures. He could not imagine a fellow half trusting a woman in that intimate relation to himself, and in those particular circumstances of conquest and loneliness, where no confidences could appear dangerous, since apparently there could be no one she could give him away to. Moreover, in 9 cases out of 10 the woman would be trusted. But trusted or mistrusted, was her presence a favourable or unfavourable condition of the problem? That was the question. The temptation to consult his chief, to talk over the weighty fact, and get his opinion on it, was great indeed. Ricardo resisted it, but the agony of his solitary mental conflict was extremely sharp. A woman in a problem is an incalculable quantity, even if you have something to go upon in forming your guess. How much more so when you haven't even caught sight of her? Swift as were his mental processes, he felt that a longer silence was inadvisable. He hastened to speak. "And do you see us, sir, you and I, with a couple of spades having to tackle this whole confounded island?" He allowed himself a slight movement of the arm. The shadow enlarged it into a sweeping gesture. "This seems rather discouraging, Martin," murmured the unmoved governor. "We mustn't be discouraged, that's all," retorted his henchman. "And after what we had to go through in that boat, too. Why would it be—" He couldn't find the qualifying words. Very calm, faithful, and yet astute, he expressed his newborn hopes darkly. "Something's got to turn up to give us a hint. Only this job can't be rushed. You may depend on me to pick up the least little bit of a hint. But you, sir, you've got to play him very gently. For the rest, you can trust me." Yes, but I asked myself what you are trusting to. "Our luck," said the faithful Ricardo. "Don't say a word against that. It might spoil the run of it." "You're a superstitious beggar. No, I won't say anything against it." "That's right, sir. Don't you even think lightly of it. Luck's not to be played with." "Yes, luck's a delicate thing," assented Mr. Jones in a dreamy whisper. A short silence ensued, which Ricardo ended in a discreet and tentative voice. "Talking of luck, I suppose he could be made to take a hand with you, sir. Two-handed picket, or Icarte, you being seedy and keeping indoors. Just to pass the time. For all we know, he may be one of them hot ones once they start." "Is it likely?" came coldly from the principal. "Considering what we know of his history, say with his partner." "True, sir. He's a cold-blooded beast. A cold-blooded, inhuman. And I'll tell you another thing that isn't likely. He would not be likely to let himself be stripped bare. We haven't got to do with a young fool that can be led on by chaff or flattery, and in the end simply overawed. This is a calculating man." Ricardo recognised that clearly. What he had in mind was something on a small scale, just to keep the enemy busy while he, Ricardo, had time to nose around a bit. "You could even lose a little money to him, sir," he suggested. "I could." Ricardo was thoughtful for a moment. "He strikes me, too, sir, as the sort of man to start prancing when one didn't expect it. What do you think, sir? Is he a man that would prance? That is, if something startled him. More likely to prance and to run. What? The answer came at once, because Mr. Jones understood the peculiar idiom of his faithful follower. Oh, without doubt, without doubt. It does me good to hear that you think so. He's a prancing beast, and we mustn't startle him. Not till I've located the stuff. Afterwards. Ricardo paused, sinister in the stillness of his pose. Suddenly he got up with a swift movement and gazed down at his chief in moody abstraction. Mr. Jones did not stir. "There's one thing that's worrying me," began Ricardo in a subdued voice. "Only one," was the faint comment from the motionless body on the bedstead. "I mean, more than all the others put together." "That's grave news." "Aye, grave enough. It's this. How do you feel in yourself, sir? Are you likely to get bored? I know them fits come on you suddenly, but surely you can tell—" "Martin, you're an ass." The moody face of the secretary brightened up. "Really, sir? Well, I'm quite content to be on these terms. I mean, as long as you don't get bored, it wouldn't do, sir." For coolness, Ricardo had thrown open his shirt and rolled up his sleeves. He moved stealthily across the room, barefooted towards the candle, the shadow of his head and shoulders growing bigger behind him on the opposite wall, to which the face of plain Mr. Jones was turned. With a feline movement, Ricardo glanced over his shoulder at the thin back of the spectre reposing on the bed, and then blew out the candle. "In fact, I'm rather amused, Martin," Mr. Jones said in the dark. He heard the sound of a slapped thigh and the jubilant exclamation of his henchman. "Good. That's the way to talk, sir." Part 4. Chapter 1. Ricardo advanced prudently by short darts from one tree trunk to another, more in the manner of a squirrel than a cat. The sun had risen some time before. Already the sparkle of an open sea was encroaching rapidly on the dark, cool, early morning blue of Diamond Bay, but the deep dusk lingered yet under the mighty pillars of the forest, between which the secretary dodged. He was watching number one's bungalow with an animal-like patience, if with a very human complexity of purpose. This was the second morning of such watching. The first one had not been rewarded by success. Well, strictly speaking, there was no hurry. The sun, swinging above the ridge all at once, inundated with light the space of burnt grass in front of Ricardo and the face of the bungalow on which his eyes were fixed, leaving only the one dark spot of the doorway. To his right, to his left, and behind him, splashes of gold appeared in the deep shade of the forest, thinning the gloom under the ragged roof of leaves. This was not a very favourable circumstance for Ricardo's purpose. He did not wish to be detected in his patient occupation, for what he was watching for was a sight of the girl. That girl! Just a glimpse across the burnt patch to see what she was like. He had excellent eyes, and the distance was not so great. He would be able to distinguish her face quite easily if she only came out onto the veranda, and she was bound to do that sooner or later. He was confident that he could form some opinion about her, which, he felt, was very necessary before venturing on some steps to get in touch with her behind that Swedish baron's back. His theoretical view of the girl was such that he was quite prepared, on the strength of that distant examination, to show himself discreetly, perhaps even make a sign. It all depended on his reading of the face. She couldn't be much. He knew that sort. By protruding his head a little, he commanded, through the foliage of a festooning creeper, a view of the three bungalows. Irregularly disposed along a flat curve, over the veranda rail of the farthermost one, hung a dark rug of a tartan pattern, amazingly conspicuous. Ricardo could see the very checks. A brisk fire of sticks was burning on the ground in front of the steps, and in the sunlight the thin, fluttering flame had paled almost to invisibility, a mere rosy stir under a faint wreath of smoke. He could see the white bandage on the head of Pedro bending over it, and the wisps of black hair standing up weirdly. He had wound that bandage himself, after breaking that shaggy and enormous head. The creature balanced it like a load, staggering towards the steps. Ricardo could see a small, long-handled saucepan at the end of a great hairy paw. Yes, he could see all that there was to be seen, far and near. Excellent eyes. The only thing they could not penetrate was the dark oblong of the doorway on the veranda under the lower eaves of the bungalow's roof. And that was vexing. It was an outrage. Ricardo was easily outraged. Surely she would come out presently. Why didn't she? Surely the fellow did not tie her up to the bedpost before leaving the house? Nothing appeared. Ricardo was as still as the leapy cables of creepers depending in a convenient curtain from the mighty limbs 60 feet above his head. His very eyelids were still, and this unblinking watchfulness gave him the dreamy air of a cat posed on a hearthrug, contemplating the fire. Was he dreaming? There, in plain sight, he had before him a white blouse-like jacket, short blue trousers, a pair of bare yellow calves, a pigtail, long and slender. "A confounded chink," he muttered, astounded. He was not conscious of having looked away, and yet right there in the middle of the picture, without having come round the right-hand corner or the left-hand corner of the house, without falling from the sky or surging up from the ground, Wang had become visible, large as life, and engaged in the young ladyish occupation of picking flowers. Step by step, stooping repeatedly over the flower-beds at the foot of the veranda, the startlingly materialized Chinaman passed off the scene in a very commonplace manner, by going up the steps and disappearing in the darkness of the doorway. Only then the yellow eyes of Martin Ricardo lost their intent fixity. He understood that it was time for him to be moving. That bunch of flowers going into the house in the hand of a Chinaman was for the breakfast table. Now, what else could it be for? "I'll give you flowers," he muttered threateningly. "You wait." Another moment, just for a glance towards the Jones bungalow, whence he expected haste to issue on his way to that breakfast so offensively decorated, and Ricardo began his retreat. His impulse, his desire, was for a rush into the open, face to face with the appointed victim, for what he called a ripping up, visualized greedily, and always with the swift preliminary stooping movement on his part, the forerunner of certain death to his adversary. This was his impulse, and as it was, so to speak, constitutional, it was extremely difficult to resist when his blood was up. What could be more trying than have to skulk and dodge and restrain oneself, mentally and physically, when one's blood was up? Mr. Secretary Ricardo began his retreat from his post of observation behind a tree opposite Haste's bungalow, using great care to remain unseen. His proceedings were made easier by the declivity of the ground, which sloped sharply down to the water's edge. There, his feet feeling the warmth of the island's rocky foundation already heated by the sun, through the thin soles of his straw slippers, he was, as it were, sunk out of sight of the houses. A short scramble of some 20 feet brought him up again to the upper level, at the place where the jetty had its root in the shore. He leaned his back against one of the lofty uprights, which still held up the company's signboard above the mound of derelict coal. Nobody could have guessed how much his blood was up. To contain himself, he folded his arms tightly on his breast. Ricardo was not used to a prolonged effort of self-control. His craft, his artfulness, felt themselves always at the mercy of his nature, which was truly feral, and only held in subjection by the influence of the governor, the prestige of a gentleman. It had its cunning, too, but it was being almost too severely tried, since the feral solution of a growl and a spring was forbidden by the problem. Ricardo dared not venture out on the cleared ground. He dared not. "If I meet the beggar," he thought, "I don't know what I mayn't do. I daren't trust myself." What exasperated him just now was his inability to understand haste. Ricardo was human enough to suffer from the discovery of his limitations. No, he couldn't size Haste up. He could kill him with extreme ease, a growl and a spring, but that was forbidden. However, he could not remain indefinitely under the funereal blackboard. "I must make a move," he thought. He moved on, his head swimming a little with the repressed desire of violence, and came out openly in front of the bungalows, as if he had just been down to the jetty to look at the boat. The sunshine enveloped him, very brilliant, very still, very hot. The 3 buildings faced him. The one with the rug on the balustrade was the most distant. Next to it was the empty bungalow. The nearest, with the flower beds at the foot of its veranda, contained that bothersome girl who had managed so provokingly to keep herself invisible. That was why Ricardo's eyes lingered on that building. The girl would surely be easier to size up than Haste. A sight of her, a mere glimpse, would have been something to go by, a step nearer to the goal, the first real move, in fact. Ricardo saw no other move. And any time she might appear on that veranda. She did not appear, but like a concealed magnet she exercised her attraction. As he went on, he deviated towards the bungalow. Though his movements were deliberate, his feral instincts had such sway that if he had met Haste walking towards him, he would have had to satisfy his need of violence. But he saw nobody. Wang was at the back of the house, keeping the coffee hot against number one's return for breakfast. Even the simian Pedro was out of sight, no doubt crouching on the doorstep, his red little eyes fastened with animal-like devotion on Mr. Jones, who was in discourse with Haste in the other bungalow, the conversation of an evil spectre with a disarmed man, watched by an ape. His will having very little to do with it, Ricardo, darting swift glances in all directions, found himself at the steps of the Haste bungalow. Once there, falling under an uncontrollable force of attraction, he mounted them with a savage and stealthy action of his limbs, and paused for a moment under the eaves to listen to the silence. Presently he advanced over the threshold one leg. It seemed to stretch itself, like a limb of india-rubber, planted his foot within, brought up the other swiftly, and stood inside the room, turning his head from side to side. To his eyes, brought in there from the dazzling sunshine, all was gloom for a moment. His pupils, like a cat's, dilating swiftly, he distinguished an enormous quantity of books. He was amazed, and he was put off too. He was vexed in his astonishment. He had meant to note the aspect and nature of things, and hoped to draw some useful inference, some hint as to the man. But what guess could one make out of a multitude of books? He didn't know what to think, and he formulated his bewilderment in the mental exclamation, "What the devil's this fellow been trying to set up here? A school?" He gave a prolonged stare to the portrait of Haste's father, that severe profile ignoring the vanities of this earth. His eyes gleamed sideways at the heavy silver candlesticks, signs of opulence. He prowled as a stray cat entering a strange place might have done, for if Ricardo had not Wang's miraculous gift of materializing and vanishing, rather than coming and going, he could be nearly as noiseless in his less elusive movements. He noted the back door standing just ajar, and all the time his slightly pointed ears, at the utmost stretch of watchfulness, kept in touch with the profound silence outside enveloping the absolute stillness of the house. He had not been in the room 2 minutes when it occurred to him that he must be alone in the bungalow. The woman, most likely, had sneaked out and was walking about somewhere in the grounds at the back. She had probably been ordered to keep out of sight. Why? Because the fellow mistrusted his guests? Or was it because he mistrusted her? Ricardo reflected that from a certain point of view it amounted nearly to the same thing. He remembered Schomburg's story. He felt that running away with somebody only to get clear of that beastly tame hotel-keeper's attention was no proof of hopeless infatuation. She could be got in touch with. His moustaches stirred. For some time he had been looking at a closed door. He would peep into that other room, and perhaps see something more informing than a confounded lot of books. As he crossed over, he thought recklessly, "If the beggar comes in suddenly and starts to prance, I'll rip him up and be done with it." He laid his hand on the handle and felt the door come unlatched. Before he pulled it open, he listened again to the silence. He felt it all about him, complete, without a flaw. The necessity of prudence had exasperated his self-restraint. A mood of ferocity woke up in him, and, as always at such times, he became physically aware of the sheeted knife strapped to his leg. He pulled at the door with fierce curiosity. It came open without a squeak of hinge, without a rustle, with no sound at all, and he found himself glaring at the opaque surface of some rough blue stuff like serge. A curtain was fitted inside, heavy enough and long enough not to stir. A curtain! This unforeseen veil, baffling his curiosity, checked his brusqueness. He did not fling it aside with an impatient movement. He only looked at it closely, as if its texture had to be examined before his hand could touch such stuff. In this interval of hesitation, he seemed to detect a flaw in the perfection of the silence, the faintest possible rustle, which his ears caught and instantly, in the effort of conscious listening, lost again. No, everything was still inside and outside the house, only he had no longer the sense of being alone there. When he put out his hand towards the motionless folds, it was with extreme caution, and merely to push the stuff aside a little, advancing his head at the same time to peep within. A moment of complete immobility ensued. Then, without anything else of him stirring, Ricardo's head shrank back on his shoulders. His arm descended slowly to his side. There was a woman in there. The very woman! Lighted dimly by the reflection of the outer glare, she loomed up strangely big and shadowy at the other end of the long, narrow room. With her back to the door, she was doing her hair with bare arms uplifted. One of them gleamed pearly white. The other detached its perfect form in black against the unshuttered, uncurtained square window-hole. She was there, her fingers busy with her dark hair, utterly unconscious, exposed and defenceless, and tempting. Ricardo drew back one foot and pressed his elbows close to his sides. His chest started heaving convulsively, as if he were wrestling or running a race. His body began to sway back and forth gently. The self-restraint was at an end. His psychology must have its way. The instinct for the feral spring could no longer be denied. Ravish or kill, it was all one to him, as long as by the act he liberated the suffering soul of savagery repressed for so long. After a quick glance over his shoulder, which hunters of big game tell us no lion or tiger omits to give before charging home, Ricardo charged, head down, straight at the curtain. The stuff, tossed up violently by his rush, settled itself with a slow, floating descent into vertical folds, motionless, without a shudder even, in the still, warm air. Chapter 2. The clock, which once upon a time had measured the hours of philosophic meditation, could not have ticked away any more than 5 seconds when Wang materialized within the living-room. His concern primarily was with the delayed breakfast, but at once his slanting eyes became immovably fixed upon the unstirring curtain. For it was behind it that he had located the strange, deadened scuffling sounds which filled the empty room. The slanting eyes of his race could not achieve a round, amazed stare, but they remained still, dead still, and his impassive yellow face grew all at once careworn and lean with the sudden strain of intense, doubtful, frightened watchfulness. Contrary impulses swayed his body, rooted to the floor mats. He even went so far as to extend his hand towards the curtain. He could not reach it, and he didn't make the necessary step forward. The mysterious struggle was going on with the confused thuds of bare feet, in a mute wrestling match, no human sound, hiss, groan, murmur, or exclamation coming through the curtain. A chair fell over, not with a crash, but lightly, as if just grazed, and a faint metallic ring of the tin bath succeeded. Finally, the tense silence, as of 2 adversaries locked in a deadly grip, was ended by the heavy, dull thump of a soft body flung against the inner partition of planks. It seemed to shake the whole bungalow. By that time, walking backward, his eyes, his very throat, strained with fearful excitement, his extended arms still pointing at the curtain, Wang had disappeared through the back door. Once out in the compound, he bolted round the end of the house. Emerging innocently between the 2 bungalows, he lingered and lounged in the open, where anybody issuing from any of the dwellings was bound to see him, a self-possessed Chinaman idling there, with nothing but perhaps an unserved breakfast on his mind. It was at this time that Wang made up his mind to give up all connection with number 1, a man not only disarmed but already half vanquished. Till that morning he had had doubts as to his course of action, but this overheard scuffle decided the question. Number 1 was a doomed man, one of those beings whom it is unlucky to help. Even as he walked in the open with a fine air of unconcern, Wang wondered that no sound of any sort was to be heard inside the house. For all he knew, the white woman might have been scuffling in there with an evil spirit, which had, of course, killed her. For nothing visible came out of the house he watched out of the slanting corner of his eye. The sunshine and the silence outside the bungalow reigned undisturbed. But in the house, the silence of the big room would not have struck an acute ear as perfect. It was troubled by a stir so faint that it could hardly be called a ghost of whispering from behind the curtain. Ricardo, feeling his throat with tender care, breathed out admiringly, "You have fingers like steel, Jiminy! You have muscles like a giant!" Luckily for Lena, Ricardo's onset had been so sudden, she was winding her 2 heavy tresses around her head, that she had no time to lower her arms. This, which saved them from being pinned to her sides, gave her a better chance to resist. His spring had nearly thrown her down. Luckily, again, she was standing so near the wall that, though she was driven against it headlong, Yet the shock was not heavy enough to knock all the breath out of her body. On the contrary, it helped her first instinctive attempt to drive her assailant backward. After the first gasp of a surprise that was really too overpowering for a cry, she was never in doubt of the nature of her danger. She defended herself in the full, clear knowledge of it, from the force of instinct, which is the true source of every great display of energy, and with a determination which could hardly have been expected from a girl who, cornered in a dim corridor by the red-faced, stammering Schomberg, had trembled with shame, disgust, and fear, had drooped, terrified, before mere words spluttered out odiously by a man who had never in his life laid his big paw on her. This new enemy's attack was simple, straightforward violence. It was not the slimy, underhand plotting to deliver her up like a slave which had sickened her heart, and made her feel in her loneliness that her oppressors were too many for her. She was no longer alone in the world now. She resisted without a moment of faltering, because she was no longer deprived of moral support, because she was a human being who counted, because she was no longer defending herself for herself alone, because of the faith that had been born in her, the faith in the man of her destiny, and perhaps in the heaven which had sent him so wonderfully to cross her path. She had defended herself principally by maintaining a desperate, murderous clutch on Ricardo's windpipe, till she felt a sudden relaxation of the terrific hug in which he stupidly and ineffectually persisted to hold her. Then, with a supreme effort of her arms, and of her suddenly raised knee, she sent him flying against the partition. The cedarwood chest stood in the way, and Ricardo, with a thump which boomed hollow through the whole bungalow, fell on it in a sitting posture, half strangled, and exhausted not so much by the efforts as by the emotions of the struggle. With the recoil of her exerted strength, she too reeled, staggered back, and sat on the edge of the bed. Out of breath, but calm and unabashed, she busied herself in readjusting under her arms the brown and yellow-figured Celebi's sarong, the tuck of which had come undone during the fight. Then, folding her bare arms tightly on her breast, she leaned forward on her crossed legs, determined and without fear. Ricardo, leaning forward too, his nervous force gone, crestfallen like a beast of prey that had missed its spring, met her big grey eyes looking at him, wide open, observing, mysterious, from under the dark arches of her courageous eyebrows. Their faces were not a foot apart. He ceased feeling about his aching throat, and dropped the palms of his hands heavily on his knees. He was not looking at her bare shoulders, at her strong arms. He was looking down at the floor. He had lost one of his straw slippers. A chair with a white dress on it had been overturned. These, with splashes of water on the floor out of a brusquely misplaced sponge bath, were the only traces of the struggle. Ricardo swallowed twice consciously, as if to make sure of his throat before he spoke again. "All right. I never meant to hurt you, though I'm no joker when it comes to it." He pulled up the leg of his pyjamas to exhibit the strapped knife. She glanced at it without moving her head, and murmured with scornful bitterness, "Ah, yes, well, that thing's stuck in my side. In no other way." He shook his head with a shamefaced smile. "Listen, I'm quiet now. Straight, I am. I don't need to explain why. You know how it is. And I can see now that this wasn't the way with you." She made no sound. Her still upward gaze had a patient mournfulness which troubled him, like a suggestion of an inconceivable depth. He added thoughtfully, "You're not going to make a noise about this silly try of mine?" She moved her head the least bit. "Jiminy, you are a wonder," he muttered earnestly, relieved more than she could have guessed. Of course, if she had attempted to run out, he would have stuck the knife between her shoulders to stop her screaming, but all the fat would have been in the fire, the business utterly spoiled, and the rage of the governor, especially when he learned the cause, boundless. A woman that does not make a noise after an attempt of that kind has tacitly condoned the offence. Ricardo had no small vanities, but clearly, if she would pass it over like this, then he could not be so utterly repugnant to her. He felt flattered, and she didn't seem afraid of him either. He already felt almost tender towards the girl, that plucky, fine girl who had not tried to run screaming from him. "We shall be friends yet. Oh, don't give you up. Don't think of it. Friends as friends can be," he whispered confidently. "Jiminy,
You aren't a tame one. Neither am I. You'll find that out before long.
He could not know that if she had not run out, it was because that morning, under the stress of growing uneasiness at the presence of the incomprehensible visitors, Haste had confessed to her that it was his revolver he had been looking for in the night, that it was gone, that he was a disarmed, defenceless man. She had hardly comprehended the meaning of his confession. Now she understood better what it meant. The effort of her self-control, her stillness, impressed Ricardo. Suddenly she spoke. "What are you after?" He did not raise his eyes. His hands reposing on his knees, his drooping head, something reflective in his pose, suggested the weariness of a simple soul, the fatigue of a mental rather than physical contest. He answered the direct question by a direct statement, as if he were too tired to dissemble. "After the swag." The word was strange to her. The veiled ardour of her grey gaze from under the dark eyebrows never left Ricardo's. "A swag?" she murmured quietly. "What's that?"
Why, swag, plunder. What your gentleman's been pinching right and left for years. The pieces. Don't you know? This."
Without looking up, he made the motion of counting money into the palm of his hand. She lowered her eyes slightly to observe this bit of pantomime, but returned them to his face at once. Then, in a mere breath, "How do you know anything about him?" she asked, concealing her puzzled alarm. "What's it got to do with you?" "Everything," was Ricardo's concise answer, in a low, emphatic whisper. He reflected that this girl was really his best hope. Out of the unfaded impression of past violence, there was growing the sort of sentiment which prevents a man from being indifferent to a woman he has once held in his arms, if even against her will, and still more so if she had pardoned the outrage. It becomes then a sort of bond. He felt positively the need to confide in her, a subtle trait of masculinity, this almost physical need of a trust which can exist side by side with the most brutal readiness of suspicion. "It's a game of grab, see?" he went on, with a new inflection of intimacy in his murmur. He was looking straight at her now.
"That fat, tame slug of a ginslinger, Schomburg, put us up to it."
So strong is the impression of helpless and persecuted misery that the girl who had fought down a savage assault without faltering could not completely repress a shudder at the mere sound of the abhorred name. Ricardo became more rapid and confidential.
"He wants to pay him off. Pay both of you at that. So he told me. He was hot after you. He would have given all he had into those hands of yours that have nearly strangled me. But you couldn't, eh? Now how... what?"
He paused.
"So, rather than... you followed a gentleman?"
He noticed a slight movement of her head and spoke quickly.
"Same here, rather than be a wage slave. Only these foreigners ought to be trusted. You're too good for him. A man that'll rob his best chum."
She raised her head. He went on, well pleased with his progress, whispering hurriedly,
"Yes, I know all about him. So you may guess how he's likely to treat a woman after a bit."
He did not know that he was striking terror into her breast now. Still the grey eyes remained fixed on him, unmovably watchful, as if sleepy under the white forehead. She was beginning to understand. His words conveyed a definite, dreadful meaning to her mind, which he proceeded to enlighten further in a convinced murmur.
"You and I are made to understand each other. Born alike, bred alike, I guess. You're not tame. Same here. You've been chucked out into this rotten world of hypocrites. Well, same here."
Her stillness, her appalled stillness, wore to him an air of fascinated attention. He asked abruptly,
"Where is it?"
She made an effort to breathe out, "Where's what?" His tone expressed excited secrecy.
"The swag, plunder, pieces. It's a game of grab. We must have it. But it isn't easy, and so you'll have to lend a hand. Come, is it kept in the house?"
As often with women, her wits were sharpened by the very terror of the glimpsed menace. She shook her head negatively. "No."
"Sure?"
"Sure," she said.
"I thought so. Does your gentleman trust you?"
Again she shook her head.
"Blamed hypocrite,"
he said feelingly, and then reflected.
"He's one of the tame ones, ain't he?"
"You'd better find out for yourself," she said.
"You trust me?" I don't want to die before you and I made friends."
This was said with a strange air of feline gallantry. Then tentatively,
"But he could be brought to trust you, couldn't he?"
"Trust me?" she said, in a tone which bordered on despair, but which he mistook for derision.
"Stand in with us," he urged. "Give the chuck to all this blamed hypocrisy. Perhaps without being trusted you managed to find out something already, eh?"
"Perhaps I have," she uttered with lips that seemed to her to be freezing fast. Ricardo now looked at her calm face with something like respect. He was even a little awed by her stillness, by her economy of words. Womanlike, she felt the effect she had produced, the effect of knowing much and of keeping all her knowledge in reserve. So far, somehow, this had come about of itself. Thus encouraged, directed in the way of duplicity, the refuge of the weak and the cowardly, but of the disarmed too. Nothing stood between the enchanted dream of her existence and a cruel catastrophe but her duplicity. It seemed to her that the man sitting before her was an unavoidable presence which had attended all her life. He was the embodied evil of the world. She was not ashamed of her duplicity. With a woman's frank courage, as soon as she saw that opening, she thrust herself into it without reserve, with only one doubt, that of her own strength. She was appalled by the situation, but already all her aroused femininity, understanding that whether Haste loved her or not, she loved him, and feeling that she had brought this on his head, faced the danger with a passionate desire to defend her own. Chapter 3. To Ricardo, the girl had been so unforeseen that he was unable to bring upon her the light of his critical faculties. Her smile appeared to him full of promise. He had not expected her to be what she was. Who, from the talk he had heard, could expect to meet a girl like this? She was a bloomin' miracle, he said to himself, familiarly, yet with a tinge of respect. She was no meat for the likes of that tame, respectable gin-slinger. Ricardo grew hot with indignation. Her courage, her physical strength, demonstrated at the cost of his discomfiture, commanded his sympathy. He felt himself drawn to her by the proofs of her amazing spirit. Such a girl! She had a strong soul, and her reflective disposition to throw over her connection proved that she was no hypocrite. "Is your gentleman a good shot?" he said, looking down on the floor again as if indifferent. She hardly understood the phrase, but in its form it suggested some accomplishment. It was safe to whisper an affirmative. "Yes." "Mine too, and better than good," Ricardo murmured, and then, in a confidential burst, "I'm not so good at it, but I carry a pretty deadly thing about me, all the same." He tapped his leg. She was past the stage of shudders now. Stiff all over, unable even to move her eyes, she felt an awful mental tension which was like blank forgetfulness. Ricardo tried to influence her in his own way. "And my gentleman's not the sort that would drop me. He ain't no foreigner. Whereas you, with your baron, you don't know what's before you. Or rather, being a woman, you know only too well. Much better not to wait for the chuck. Pile in with us and get your share. Of the plunder, I mean. You have some notion about it already." She felt that if she had as much hinted by word or sign that there was any such thing on the island, Haste's life wouldn't be worth half an hour's purchase. But all power of combining words had vanished in the tension of her mind. Words themselves were too difficult to think of, all except the word yes, the saving word. She whispered it with not a feature of her face moving. To Ricardo, the faint and concise sound proved a cool, reserved assent, more worth having from that amazing mistress of herself than 1,000 words from any other woman. He thought with exultation that he had come upon 1 in 1,000,000, in 10 millions. His whisper became frankly entreating. "That's good. Now all you've got to do is make sure where he keeps his swag. Only do be quick about it. I can't stand much longer this crawling on the stomach business, so as not to scare your gentleman. What do you think a fellow is, a reptile?" She stared without seeing anyone, as a person in the night sits staring and listening to deadly sounds, to evil incantations. And always in her head there was that tension of the mind trying to get hold of something, of a saving idea which seemed to be so near and could not be captured. Suddenly she seized it. Yes, she had to get that man out of the house. At that very moment, raised outside, not very near, but heard distinctly, Haste's voice uttered the words, "Have you been looking out for me, Wang?" It was for her like a flash of lightning framed in the darkness which had beset her on all sides, showing a deadly precipice right under her feet. With a convulsive movement she sat up straight, but had no power to rise. Ricardo, on the contrary, was on his feet on the instant, as noiseless as a cat. His yellow eyes gleamed, gliding here and there, but he too seemed unable to make another movement. Only his moustaches stirred visibly, like the feelers of some animal. Wang's answer, "Ya Tuan," was heard by the two in the room, but more faintly. Then haste again. "All right, you may bring the coffee in. Memputi out in the room yet?" To this question Wang made no answer. Ricardo's and the girl's eyes met, utterly without expression, all their faculties being absorbed in listening for the first sound of Haste's footsteps, for any sound outside which could mean that Ricardo's retreat was cut off. Both understood perfectly well that Wang must have gone round the house, and that he was now at the back, making it impossible for Ricardo to slip out unseen that way before Haste came in at the front. A darkling shade settled on the face of the devoted secretary. Here was the business utterly spoiled. It was the gloom of anger and even of apprehension. He would perhaps have made a dash for it through the back door if Haste had not been heard ascending the front steps. He climbed them slowly, very slowly, like a man who is discouraged or weary, or simply thoughtful. And Ricardo had a mental vision of his face, with its martial moustache, the lofty forehead, the impassive features, and the quiet, meditative eyes. Trapped! Confound it! After all, perhaps the governor was right. Women had to be shunned. Fooling with this one had apparently ruined the whole business. For, trapped as he was, he might just as well kill, since, anyhow, to be seen was to be unmasked. But he was too fair-minded to be angry with the girl. Haste had paused on the veranda, or in the very doorway. "I shall be shot down like a dog if I ain't quick," Ricardo muttered excitedly to the girl. He stooped to get hold of his knife, and the next moment would have hurled himself out through the curtain, nearly as prompt and fully as deadly to Haste as an unexpected thunderbolt. The feel more than the strength of the girl's hand, clutching at his shoulder, checked him. He swung round, crouching with a yellow upward glare. Ah! Was she turning against him? He would have stuck his knife into the hollow of her bare throat if he had not seen her other hand pointing to the window. It was a long opening, high up, close under the ceiling almost, with a single pivoting shutter. While he was still looking at it, she moved noiselessly away, picking up the overturned chair and placing it under the wall. Then she looked round, but he didn't need to be beckoned to. In 2 long, tiptoeing strides he was at her side. "Be quick," she gasped. He seized her hand and wrung it with all the force of his dumb gratitude, as a man does to a chum when there is no time for words. Then he mounted the chair. Ricardo was short, too short to get over without a noisy scramble. He hesitated an instant. She, watchful, bore rigidly on the seat, with her beautiful bare arms, while, light and sure, he used the back of the chair as a ladder. The masses of her brown hair fell all about her face. Footsteps resounded in the next room, and Haste's voice, not very loud, called her by name. "Lena!" "Yes, in a minute," she answered, with a particular intonation which she knew would prevent Haste from coming in at once. When she looked up, Ricardo had vanished, letting himself down outside so lightly that she had not heard the slightest noise. She stood up then, bewildered, frightened, as if awakened from a drugged sleep, with heavy, downcast, unseeing eyes, her fortitude tired out, her imagination as if dead within her, and unable to keep her fear alive. Haste moved about aimlessly in the other room. This sound roused her exhausted wits. At once she began to think, hear, see, and what she saw, or rather recognised, for her eyes had been resting on it all the time, was Ricardo's straw slipper, lost in the scuffle, lying near the bath. She had just time to step forward and plant her foot on it when the curtains shook and, pushed aside, disclosed Haste in the doorway. Out of the appeased enchantment of the senses, she had found with him, like a sort of bewitched state, his danger brought a sensation of warmth to her breast. She felt something stir in there, something profound, like a new sort of life. The room was in partial darkness, Ricardo having accidentally swung the pivoted shutter as he went out of the window. Haste peered from the doorway. "Why, you haven't done your hair yet," he said. "I won't stop to do it now. I shan't be long," she replied steadily, and remained still, feeling Ricardo's slipper under the sole of her foot. Haste, with a movement of retreat, let the curtain drop slowly. On the instant she stooped for the slipper, and with it in her hand spun round wildly, looking for some hiding place. But there was no such spot in the bare room. The chest, the leather bunk, a dress or two of hers hanging on pegs. There was no place where the merest hazard might not guide Haste's hand at any moment. Her wildly roaming eyes were caught by the half-closed window. She ran to it, and by raising herself on her toes, was able to reach the shutter with her fingertips. She pushed it square, stole back to the middle of the room, and turning about, swung her arm, regulating the force of the throw so as not to let the slipper fly too far out and hit the edge of the overhanging eaves. It was a task of the nicest judgment for the muscles of those round arms, still quivering from the deadly wrestle with a man, for that brain, tense with the excitement of the situation, and for the unstrung nerves flickering darkness before her eyes. At last the slipper left her hand. As soon as it passed the opening, it was out of her sight. She listened. She did not hear it strike anything. It just vanished, as if it had wings to fly on through the air. Not a sound. It had gone clear. Her valiant arms hanging close against her side, she stood as if turned into stone. A faint whistle reached her ears. The forgetful Ricardo, becoming very aware of his loss, had been hanging about in great anxiety, which was relieved by the appearance of the slipper flying from under the eaves, and now, thoughtfully, he had ventured a whistle to put her mind at ease. Suddenly the girl reeled forward. She saved herself from a fall only by embracing with both arms one of the tall, roughly carved posts holding the mosquito net above the bed. For a long time she clung to it, with her forehead leaning against the wood. One side of her loosened sarong had slipped down as low as her hip. The long brown tresses of her hair fell in lank wisps, as if wet, almost black against her white body. Her uncovered flank, damp with the sweat of anguish and fatigue, gleamed coldly with the immobility of polished marble in the hot, diffused light falling through the window above her head, a dim reflection of the consuming, passionate blaze of sunshine outside, all a-quiver with the effort to set the earth on fire, to burn it to ashes.